After cock-teasing everyone for several years, Bethesda has once again let Todd Sweet Lies Howard ascend the stage to show off their next game. Fallout 5, Fallout in Space, Starfield. And, to the shock and surprise of absolutely no one, the game looks just as uninspired, boring, and gutted as any of Bethesda's more recent role-playing offerings. I wish I could conjure up an emotion other than apathy when looking at Starfield. I can't really be surprised, since Bethesda has been dumbing down their games for well over a decade. And I can't be angry, since Starfield is a new IP, so, by default, it has no fanbase to piss off, or established gameplay pillars to topple until the damn thing comes out sometime in 2023. Even though I am firmly in the camp of people who think Starfield looks boring as sin, hollow as fuck, and more shallower than a kiddie pool in the Sahara, I do reserve final judgment until I get to play the game. And why would I not? I love sci-fi, I love role-playing games, and I love space sims. I want the game to come out, and I want it to blow me away. I want Starfield to be good. But I am way too old and way too jaded to believe for a fraction of a second that Starfield looks like anything else but a more casualized version of the Outer Worlds, yeah, it's possible, mixed with No Man's Sky. But I do think Starfield will be a bellwether game. Its successes and its failures could have a very profound impact on the future of not only role-playing games as a genre, but on the entire industry. My hypothesis is simple. If Starfield fails, then it could be a welcome sign that gamers are starting to finally wise up to the usual marketing bullshit that most AAA publishers push. With the possible 1-2 punch of the two biggest AAA RPGs going up like the fucking Hindenburg back to back, could, in a more perfect world, give the video game industry the course correction it so desperately needs. But if the more likely inverse happens, and Starfield ends up printing more money than the Treasury Department, then there are two possible outcomes from there. The first and most probable is that Starfield comes out, is a rip-roaring success, and pushes the game industry one step closer to the homogenized gray slop where genres don't exist and every game is a third-person open-world action-adventure game with crouch stealth and a bow, RPG elements, and a shallow base-building mechanic. The second and least likely outcome has more or less the same short-term effects as the first, but with the small spark of hope that years from now, Starfield's successes could drastically change the industry for the better. See, while on stage, Todd, look at that smile, Howard announced to the whole world that Starfield will have over 1,000 full-sized planets to explore, with Todd confirming in an interview that Starfield will be using procedural, not random generation. And while that is an important difference to me, I realize that not everyone knows what the hell these two things are, or the difference between them. So, allow me to explain. And as always, I'm just some retard on the internet, so if I get something wrong, oh no, boo-hoo, I really doubt you're gonna fact check it anyways. Games that use random generation are stitching together large pre-made chunks of content. It's usually levels, like with Hades and the Binding of Isaac. On the other hand, procedural generation is much harder to do, but has a much bigger payoff. Instead of the game just fitting pre-made chunks of content together, a game that uses procedural generation instead generates entire levels on the fly, out of much smaller pre-made art assets. Think Minecraft and its blocks, or No Man's Sky. And No Man's Sky is actually a very good example of what procedural generation is capable of, and also a warning of its pitfalls. When No Man's Sky came out, it had a lot of issues, but one of them was also the game's selling point, a massive universe of thousands of planets all made with procedural generation. And all those planets turned out to be empty, barren, ugly dust balls, where all the player did was gather resources in order to build a base. Stop me if this is starting to sound familiar. Unless Bethesda has been secretively making several key breakthroughs in procedural generation, then the current technology is simply not cut out to do what Todd and Bethesda are aiming to do with it. If Starfield comes out and does well regardless, then it might be the game that gets other publishers and developers to finally start pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into working out procedural generation's current kinks. And that is ultimately a good thing, because I think procedural generation is poised to be the next big thing in gaming. Hear me out. For decades, hell, ever since the very beginning of video games to be quite honest, gaming has been in a nuclear arms race to see who can pump out the best looking polygons at the expense of everything else, but graphics are finally starting to plateau. This means that game publishers are having a harder and harder time selling video games on visual fidelity alone. The industry knows that the graphics horse is nearing the finish line sooner rather than later, and they are already groping in the dark for the next big thing to market games with. Everything from frame rate to resolution, and I think the one that's gonna stick is the size of one game's open world compared to another's. The marketing writes itself. Assassin's Creed 8 is 10 by 10 real-life miles. Oh yeah? Well, Dragon Age 6 is 100 by 100 real-life miles. Starfield is 1,000 planets. Mass Effect 5 has 100,000. It's gonna be Sega versus Nintendo all over again, but instead of blast processing in bits, it's gonna be miles and playtime. But if the size of a game's open world becomes its new selling point, then the sizes of open world games will only increase exponentially, thereby exasperating all of the problems with current open world game development and design. The two biggest hurdles that I see is developing the game within a decent amount of time and also filling it with enough quality content to justify the size of the open world. Two things that even current open world games struggle with greatly. But if procedural generation can be advanced to a point where it can generate not only open worlds, but something more akin to traditional handmade content, then the game can largely build itself, or at least build large portions of itself that the devs can then play through and then tweak as necessary. Thus cutting down on development time, and also partly solving the issue with Ubisoft-style open-world game design. You can have a game that is 1,000 planets, full size, full scale, and fill it with at least some form of meaningful content, and not take 20 years to make the damn thing. For example, a future game that utilizes advanced enough procedural generation and AI could change drastically and dynamically with every decision you make, regardless if it was a choice that was initially accounted for by the designers or not. Let's say you killed the king in a quest where the king should live. In a modern day role-playing game, you'd be progression locked at best or simply not allowed to kill him off at worst. Do something completely unhinged like murder an entire village and the game won't really change. You might autofill some side quests, but who gives a fuck? But in our future game, killing the king or slaughtering the village would instead create new content. It would spin off new quests, generate new characters, make new dungeons, create new items that never existed before we took those actions. Effectively replicating what a dungeon master does when playing Dungeons & Dragons, and his players go apeshit and start doing things he never accounted for. The game would react to what the player does moment to moment, decision to decision in meaningful and substantial ways. If this future game were to be made, it would be the fulfillment of one of the longest dreams in the history of video games. One shared by the likes of Richard Garriott, Michael Toy, Glenn Wickman, Andrew Greenberg, Robert Woodhead, and the games they created. A dream that spurred the creation of the greatest and most influential genre in all of gaming. The dream of authentically recreating the act of playing D&D, but with the computer as the dungeon master. Role-playing games were already taking steps towards the realization of the dream in the mid and late 90s, with the likes of Daggerfall and Diablo flirting with procedural generation, before the genre entered a semi-dark age in the early 2000s. And after being briefly resurrected in the very late 2000s and very early 10s, it would only suffer a fate worse than death. Being watered down to the point of redundancy and having their mechanics stolen and poorly grafted onto other genres, after Call of Duty 4 made everyone realize adding an EXP bar to progression will get low IQ window lickers to play it until the fucking sun burns out. What I'm trying to say is that RPGs have been stagnant as a genre for the past 20 years. I'd even argue they've regressed. But the time has finally come for role-playing games to move forward and to once again reclaim their rightful place as the kings of the industry. And one of the biggest steps on the road to recovery is advancing procedural generation. And if Starfield's lackluster-looking ass isn't the game to kickstart it, then it'll be another game, like the upcoming Wayward Realms, because this future will happen. The dream of replicating pen and paper role-playing games in digital form has proven too alluring to too many people over these 40 years to just die. And if that sad day ever does come to pass, when RPGs do die for good, then gaming itself is right behind it.